Good afternoon, everybody. Please take your seats. We're delighted to see you all. I'm so glad we're going to have a brief introduction from
Welcome,
Austin
everyone.
Rios.
It's wonderful to see you. Thanks for hanging around. Thanks for coming. If this is, if you weren't here for our Palm Sunday service before, we are so thrilled. And if you're joining us online, welcome as well. We're so glad to welcome you to Grace Cathedral, and particularly to this conversation with Bishop Mariann Budde from the Diocese of Washington. Can we give it up a little bit for her? I just want to say that having witnessed that experience a couple of times since you've been in the diocese so far, I'm amazed with your ability to go with it. So well done, well done. Being gracious after being applauded.
When you go to the East Coast, it's going to be exactly the same.
Yeah.
She's going to make sure everybody's prepared.
Obviously, you know a little bit about Bishop Budde, but I wanted to encourage Dean Young to share a little bit more about her before we get into our conversation.
Great. Mariann Budde is the bishop and spiritual leader of the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, D.C. and the Washington National Cathedral. On January 21st, 2025, many Americans were introduced to Bishop Budde thanks to what the New York Times called, quote, an extraordinary act of public resistance. During her prayer service for Donald J. Trump's second inauguration, Bishop Budde addressed the president directly, imploring him, quote, to have mercy on the people in our country who are scared now, from those who are part of the LGBTQ plus community to immigrants and refugees. But for Bishop Budde, this moment was the culmination of a lifetime spent thinking about and acting when we're called on to push past our fears and act with strength. In her most recent book, How We Learn to Be Brave, Decisive Moments in Life and Faith, Bishop Budde explores the full range of decisive moments and seamlessly weaves together personal experiences with story from scripture, history, and pop culture to underscore both the universality of these moments and the particular call each one of us must heed when they arrive. So today we're going to be talking about how being brave is not a singular occurrence. It's a journey that we can choose to undertake every day.
It's awesome.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, as we're beginning, I just want to give you a little idea about our format, and then we're going to hop right into it so we can maximize our time. We're going to alternate questions, and we're going to try to make sure that she gets to talk the most. For those of you who, we're going to also assume that a good chunk of us have read her book, How to Learn to Be Brave, and if you have not, I encourage you to get a copy of it. I encourage you to read it, inwardly digest it. Marking is up to you, but I'm going to ask some questions as if we've read some of the book. Okay, so hopefully for those of you who have, that will be a chance to go in further with that. But without further ado, my first question: we've just celebrated the Palm Sunday liturgy, and thank you for your sermon. I am curious, how do you navigate the difficult balance between the political dimension of the gospel and the separation of church and state?
Well, that's a question everyone in faith traditions have to wrestle with in this country, right? So it's not unique to me. I think we have our founding documents of the nation, and we have a scriptural mandate of our faith. And there really isn't anything in the understanding of our foremothers and fathers that we, as Christians, we couldn't be involved politically. It was meant to protect the citizenry from one religion having supremacy in the country, and also to protect religion from undue pressure from the state, right? So I think we've got a pretty wide lane when it comes to being engaged politically. But that said, I'm persuaded that if I or anyone as a person of faith is going to be involved in public discourse and the betterment of public life, that we don't do so with an eye toward strengthening our religion, but making the society better. And then using the moral precepts of our faith that encourage the well-being of all people and doing what we can to promote that. So I think we're at our best as people of faith when we keep our eye on that focus. And there are all of the scriptural teachings about the dignity of every human being, the rights or the needs of all people to have their basic needs met, the precepts of justice in a society. I think that those are the places where we can lean. But you're not going to see me looking for special protection for Christians, mostly protections for all of us, because that's what God would desire. So?
Thank you.
Okay.
We appreciate your sermon so much, and you have so much to do with writing the presentation you gave on Wednesday in Berkeley and doing the sermon. I really appreciate it. And in the sermon, just for those who may not have been here, the sermon is about the serenity prayer in a way. Like, how do you know, though, when it's something that you just have to accept, how do you know when it's something that you can change? And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just like your deliberations, just before the bishop or the president walked across Lafayette Square and waved the Bible in front of St. John's, that one incident, and then just your preparation before doing the sermon during inauguration week. Like, how did you know what to say and what to do in those circumstances? Knowing
is an elusive thing.
Yeah, that's right. Good point.
You don't know. I don't know. The first instance with the president crossing over first of all, threatening force on peaceful protesters, then using force on peaceful protesters to clear the square, and then taking a photograph or having a photograph taken with the Bible. So those all things were happening in rapid succession in the context of the George Floyd murder and at the peak of COVID. So no pressure, no stress anywhere. We were all just every nerve ending for every American was just exploding. And we had a president who was doing everything he could to make it worse rather than to speak calm and to bring us back into some kind of semblance of a unified country. And so I didn't really have time to think. I was more responding to what was a clear signal from both within myself and from people who were texting me furiously at that time that I couldn't let the sun go down with even the perception that mantle of spiritual authority that he had claimed was something that we condoned, right? I was in a rare moment where it was actually on our turf, right? I mean, it was on my watch. It wasn't some abstract place. It was our church. And the rector, by the way, happened to be like his one vacation away since COVID. So he was gone, right? So, I mean, the poor guy. And I'm like, I'm sorry, Rob, I've got to do this. But, and of course he was fine. But it was just such a volatile moment. And you all know what that's like when you don't have time to think, right? You're relying on something else, right? So that's what that was, which was the other one. In January, I had way too much time to think. I mean, oh, jeez. Because I knew I was going to preach that sermon back in June, right, before the outcome of the election, and then, God, the outcome of the election and the whole leading up to the inauguration, it was just a constant wondering what to say. What on earth to possibly say? And I think you've probably heard, or I can tell you briefly, that I had originally had a sermon that was focused on the foundations of unity, which were 3. And it wasn't until the last 24 hours or so, and then really the last few hours, when I and a few people who were helping me think it through, like, actually, there's a fourth. There's a fourth. And then I think the stepping in was I just felt, and I'd been inspired by other people who were speaking out, but just feeling like on the day of the inauguration, the president had spoken so cruelly and misleadingly, dishonestly about the two groups of people that I mentioned, that were people among whom are some of my closest friends and people I love and serve, that you can't just paint all immigrants as dangerous criminals, and you can't paint all LGBTQ people as if they were a threat to our society and our way of life, that's just wrong. And he knew it, and everyone else knows it, and I had the opportunity to say it.
Yeah, I mean, when Paul was describing the last, 24 hours of writing that,
Yeah.
it just sounded harrowing. I mean, it's, just to make those changes and...
Well, that's what I was doing this morning for this
Yeah, I
sermon.
know,
So that's sort of,
it's every week.
that's sort of that's how I roll.
Yeah.
But there was a level of intensity that sure. I mean,
Well, and kind of it has to be that way, because you otherwise you would have written a sermon before having heard the inaugural address.
Right.
And so it would have been outdated. It would have been the sermon from 3 days ago instead of the
Right,
sermon that
right.
went right then.
And I suspect, for those of you who are clergy, or any of you really, in any kind of conversation or discourse, things are happening so fast that it feels that way every day, which I think is one of the harder things about what we're dealing with now, right? How do we respond, and what do we have the capacity to change, and what don't we? I'd just like to share one thing that I tried to fit into the sermon somewhere, and I really couldn't this morning. And it was a conversation I had with a rabbi who had invited me to be, there's a rabbi in Washington who every Wednesday morning at 8 o'clock has a Zoom meeting with members of the Senate, of the U.S. Senate. And it may have been a bipartisan group at some point, but now it's all members of the Democratic Party. There are about 8 who are on the call. They meet every week. They have a time of meditation. They pray. They support each other, right? And they invited me to be on the call, and I was happy to be on it. And we talked, obviously we talked politics, but the thing that I came away with, which was so heartbreaking, was the sense of grief that several, and one senator in particular, discussed about the loss of friendship and the loss of even understanding what happened to some of his colleagues that are now working against the very things that they worked so hard to stitch together in a bipartisan way. And the grief of that, when I was thinking about the grief of acceptance, right? The grief of just seeing that and not knowing what to do. He was angry, but he was also really sad. And do you know what I mean? That kind of okay, this is the world we're in now. And what we thought was once true, perhaps is true no longer, or at least not for now. And so I carry that with me as a reminder of the profound loss of so much. And then how do we live with that?
Yeah.
How do we live with that?
Yeah, the grief of things being broken that we think may never be able to be repaired.
I won't go that far. I think they can be repaired, but I don't think it's going to be easy. And I don't have a crystal ball. It's not, that's, one of the things that happens in a situation like I'm in right now is I'm asked questions about which I know almost nothing, right? Topics I have no expertise in whatsoever, people ask my opinion on, and I don't know how to rebuild those relationships. I only know that if there's any place where we can help make that happen, it's right here, right? It's right here. We have to find a way, when the time comes, to help rebuild, reweave the country together when that time comes. Right?
Okay, so I'm going to go to the book. So hopefully this feels like a wheelhouse area.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Phew.
Do you mean the Book of Common Prayer?
I do mean the Book of Common Prayer.
Okay.
I do. Okay, so you mentioned this story of Jesus reading from the scroll of Isaiah in Nazareth in chapter 5, stepping up to the plate. Mm-hmm. For those of you who may not be as familiar with that story as others, here's kind of what that is. Jesus is in Nazareth. Jesus rolled up the scroll, sat down, and quietly said, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." With calm confidence, he identified himself as the one anointed by God. He had heard his own vocation affirmed in Isaiah's words. Jesus was clear and he was ready. It didn't matter to him when his own community, after initially speaking highly of him, took offense at his words and turned against him. He simply went on his way to the work that was his to do. So that's what you wrote. This is the question. You just had a very public stepping up to the plate moment with your sermon heard around the world. Have you ever experienced the kind of whiplash that Jesus does when the local crowd goes from cheering Jesus to wanting to toss him off a cliff? And what might you want to say to those of us who can be swept up in mob mentality and to those who might find their fortunes reversed due to shifting public perceptions?
Well, I'm not in the league of Jesus, so let's just put that over there. But I certainly know, and in small ways, it's helpful. It's helpful to have practice in small things before really big things happen, right? I think it was C.S. Lewis who said, on a completely different topic, that if you're going to practice forgiveness, best not to start with the Gestapo, right? And with public shaming, it's best when it happens in small doses so you can get used to the feeling. But I think that I would say is that the hardest thing about the attention, be it positive or negative, is that it is, in the end, ultimately a bit distorting, right? To the person inside, right? It's just a bit distorting. It's not, and the experience of receiving a lot of admiration and then having those same people be really, really angry with me, that has happened. Mm-hmm. And it's harder for me to deal with people who are angry with me that I have considered allies and friends than those who have never liked me to begin with, right? And that is actually quite painful. And that's happened to me as bishop on 2 occasions. And the last time I wasn't sure my episcopate would survive. It was that intense. And it's in the book, I mention it. It was when, shortly after, maybe 6 months after, and just after the Episcopal News Service wrote this great article about me, like I was just the best bishop ever. And then Dean Hollerith invited Max Lucado to come and preach at Washington National Cathedral, and there was a stir that started on social media the Thursday before, which came to me, and I agreed with the dean that we shouldn't rescind the invitation at the last minute. And what came toward us and what came toward me was this wave, not only of first of anger, just sheer rage. How could you invite such a man into the pulpit of Washington National Cathedral? Then came the grief. And for those of you who don't know Max Lucado, he is a prominent author, very just enormously successful author and minister who in the past has said some very, very hurtful things about gay people. I mean, really horrific things, for which he has now expressed regret. But he's never publicly said that his position on the full inclusion celebration of LGBTQ life is something he would affirm. But privately, anyway. For then came the grief of all the people who wrote me not just a letter, but like paragraphs and paragraphs and paragraphs, telling me their life story and how painful it was to have Max Lucado quoted to them when they were kids, right? And then when Gene Robinson, God bless him, stood next to me and the dean and said, "We can afford to be generous because we're okay now." Then the parents of trans kids started writing us and said, "You know what? They're not okay now. I'm really afraid for my kids." Right? And this went on for about as long as this whole, like all the standing ovations and stuff you've been giving me. The opposite of that was going on for a very long time in the height of COVID, And all I could do in that time was apologize, right? And apologize, and apologize again. And I think I apologized in one form or another for about a month, right? So it's not quite the same as what you said, but it was a similar kind of whiplash, right? And I felt as if I had broken a trust that I wasn't sure I'd be able to get back, right? Even though I thought, you know, in the way you think when you're not really thinking, well, people know me. They know I would never. But that wasn't the point, right? The point was the pain I had caused and the hurt. And then there was a sort of pile-on effect, too. Like, then all of my clergy had to tell me how then they all had to go on social media and denounce what I said, right? So there was just this like, okay, I get it, right? I get it. You have every right to be angry with me. But I also learned in that moment the power of just staying in the heat of it, right? So I've learned, one of the things I've learned is that when I've really messed up, and you know, and I have, and I will again, it's really good to own it, right? And to seek repair. And I have a little bit more compassion for people who mess up publicly, because there isn't a lot of room right now for nuance, do you know?
I remember actually exactly where I was standing when I was talking to Randy. I called him because everything was going haywire.
Yeah.
And I just called him as a friend and as a colleague, and I remember just where I was standing as we had that conversation.
Yeah, it was the, now again, there's a lot of things that make that a unique thing that isn't maybe even what you were talking about, but it's a similar sense of like, what it's done for me is try to wear lightly all of it, right? To try to wear, I'm very grateful for all of the people, all of you and your appreciation, and I'm trying to sort of get up in the morning and do my life. And believe me, my poor husband has to look adoringly at me from the front row of every gathering like this, and I'm still, the slightly adorable, irritating wife he married 40 years ago, right? So, and so that's just sort of. Do you know what I'm saying? And then also when the waves of criticism come, like Brian Stevenson says, you're not the worst thing you've ever done, right? And to try and remember that for each other, that maybe we can allow the humanity of one another to counteract those two things. Is that what you were going for?
That is.
Have you had an experience like that? I mean, have you had?
Oh yeah, and very similar to that, where it's least expected. Like
Right.
that's the painful one.
Right.
But once you get a chance to actually respond with that kind of grace and being with it, as opposed to running from it,
Right.
that's where the learning is.
That's where the learning is. That's where the learning is. And I think I was also trying to say to the president and to all of us that in public life as well as private, we all need mercy because we're all going to mess up, right? And some days I'm the one who can offer mercy, but tomorrow I'm going to need it. Mm-hmm. And that's also where the humility comes in, right? I may get it right today and be really wrong tomorrow. And so will anyone. And right now in our public life and in political discourse, that kind of grace is just non-existent. Yep. Non-existent. And that has to change. And, when we're going about rebuilding the country that we want to live in again, we have to change that. We have to allow people to be human and still lead, because we lost a lot of really good people. And I'm speaking about Democrats. We lost a lot of really good people who could not survive the onslaught that they got from their own flank. And if we want human beings to run our nation, we have to let them be human and find ways to build up the best in one another again, and that's gonna take all of us.
Thank you. On Wednesday, you gave the Robert Bella lecture, and there's so much about that I just absolutely love. For one thing, I love Robert Bella, but what you had to say was so great too. And I think part of I mean, I think part of what you're saying is, we become symbols of much bigger things, and we just have to recognize that we are symbols of those things. Mm-hmm. So it's not just about like personal mistakes. It's just like we can't get confused with the symbol. And in your book, you write a lot about Ed Friedman, who, my friends who've had contact with him, have admired him so much. But what did you learn from Ed Friedman in terms of like that symbolic part of your life, not getting confused about your roles, recognizing boundaries? What did you learn from Ed Friedman that helps you in moments like this that Austin raised?
Wow. What did I learn from Ed Friedman?
So Ed Friedman, while you're thinking, I'm going to...
Yeah, you can tell me who he is.
So Ed Friedman is a prominent Jewish person who wrote books about congregational life, and it doesn't matter whether you're in a synagogue or a mosque or a church, he writes about that dynamic that's shared in a congregation.
Well, I think one of the many things I learned from him, he was also a family systems therapist, trained in Bowen theory. And one of the things I learned from him is that you bring who you are wherever you go. And that we are sort of in a confluence of relationships all the time. And so we're in our family relationship, we're in relationship with our community, and we're in a relationship with the wider society. And we all, and the goal is in some ways to bring the same self into all of them, right? Like not to have different, but to also recognize that that if there's an issue going on in my family, it's probably going to show up in my work and vice versa. And that there may be some people in my public life who sound surprisingly like the stepmother I couldn't get along with. And that may have an impact on how I treat that person, right? Which has nothing to do with who they are and more to do with what I'm bringing to that dynamic, right? So there was a lot of that kind of thing. And he also taught me the power of taking responsibility for where we are in any system that we're in. And so if my responsibility is to sit between the two of you, right? And suddenly I realize that the two of you are starting to have a little bit of tension, right?
Oh, right,
Theoretically, of course. I mean, just theoretically. Helper that I am, I might want to just put myself in the middle and referee, right? Wouldn't that be helpful? When in fact, the helpful thing would be to step back and to stay in relationship with the two of you and let the two of you work it out. So just things like that. So I'm not sure if it helped with but that was just like healthy relationships and seeing yourself in sort of the right place. The other thing he taught, and you and I were talking about this just briefly before we came out here again, is that whenever there's a lot of anxiety in a room or in a community, or in an organization, there's just some anxiety and tension that you don't know how to navigate, chances are pretty good that there's a secret somewhere that some people know and other people don't know. And it's not so much the secret that's the problem, but the false alliances that get built around that secret. And then also what the secret does to everything else, which is to make it really hard to distinguish between what's a big deal and really needs to be dealt with and what's not very significant at all, but is taking up a lot of attention. So we get confused about what's a big deal and what's a little deal, and our relationships are all clouded. And if we could get to the source of what that is and diffuse it, it's not going to solve all of our problems, but it's going to make everything a lot clearer. Yeah. Does that make sense?
It does. I just think for 35 years, you've become an expert in this.
Yeah.
And that's given you a certain vocabulary. And I do think it does, it's a very unique and important skill.
Yeah. I don't know if I'm an expert, but I'm a student, because it's like your own life is like on the screen and you're watching yourself. Have you ever, maybe all of you know this too, and you can hear in your voice when you kind of go up a tick, and you're sounding a little, you're talking a little faster than you normally do, or do you know what I mean? It's like, oh, there she is again. Okay, you can bring this down. Yeah, so those sorts of things. Yeah, it's good. It's good to, you mentioned it earlier, it's good to know who you are. Yeah, right?
Yeah,
it's good to know who you are.
Back to the book. I love this quote from chapter 5. You wrote, I live my entire life inside the miracle of the loaves and fish.
That's true.
Nearly every sermon I preach feels incomplete and inadequate, but I preach it anyway, praying that Jesus will fill in the gaps. My leadership is often imperfect and insufficient, but I lead to the best of my ability anyway and wait for Jesus to step in. The money I give away, particularly in response to acute human suffering, is never enough to meet the need, but I give anyway, hoping that, along with others, I might ease another's pain. The image of a few loaves and some fish feeding a multitude is meant to encourage us all to give what we have when we know it is not enough. For reasons beyond our understanding, God consistently chooses to work through our imperfect, inadequate offerings. My question is, are there other scriptural moments that have shown up for you like this?
That's the big one. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the metaphor, the parable out of which I live most of my life. Mm-hmm. The other one, I mean, there are many, right? There are many. But the other one I would say is Jesus inviting Simon Peter out onto the water, which is a similar kind of thing, right? But it reminds me too, even in just watching our children grow up, watching children grow up around us, that every day in a child's life, they have to do something they've absolutely never done before, right? Every single day. And sometimes it's terrifying, and then sometimes you see on a child's face like the absolute delight, like, I'm walking, right? You know that look until they realize they're walking and then boom, right down on the diaper again, you know? Or we're seeing this with our grandchildren, our granddaughter now especially, I'm swimming, look at me, like I'm swimming. And it's just so amazing, but the day before she couldn't do that, right? And I think that spiritually there is that same reality that Jesus calls us into, or God, the universe, calls us into things that we absolutely cannot do. So it's a similar motif, right? Mm-hmm. And we get out and we often fail. I mean, that's the other side. We often fail. In fact, even with the loaves and fish, sometimes we make our offering and it's not enough. And Jesus doesn't show up. And it's just that gap, and we live in the reality of that. Or we fail. But there's something in the failing, too, that perhaps prepares us to try again, to get better, to learn, you know? And so I see those too a lot. And we came up in the lectionary again this week, Jeremiah. We've been reading Jeremiah for those who follow the daily lectionary from the Episcopal Church. And, you know, that whole piece when Jeremiah is basically saying to the people in exile, settle in. You're going to be there for a while, like 70 years. So go ahead, get married, have kids, seek the good of the city where I have sent you, right? Just settle in. And there was something about that just resonated for me, like where we are right now. Okay, I'm not saying don't resist, but just like don't think you're going to finish this up by Tuesday, right? We're in for a ride, and it's not going to end anytime soon. So conserve your energy, be strategic, slow down, right? Mm-hmm. So that's the one for this week, I think.
Helpful.
You know, you've taught preaching before, and you know, it's been part of your ministry.
Yeah.
And when we had our clergy group meeting last week, I was saying, what kind of questions should I ask Mariann? And our group wanted to know, what is a sermon? You know, what can a sermon do, and what can a sermon not do? So just like, what is preaching and what makes it effective?
Ed Friedman, again, he said, which I thought was very helpful, he said, preaching is a gift that a person gives who has all week to think about something in depth that those who listen don't have time to think about. Right?
So true. You're totally right.
And so your offering is to have thought about it and to give the best that you can your thoughts. Right? He also said that you can tell the maturity of the people coming at you with their response by how they respond. Like if they get really furious at you, it's telling them as much about them as it is about you, because the truly mature people will say, well, thank you for giving me that to think about. I totally disagree with you, but you've given me something to think about, right? Yeah. So it's that sense of like, okay, but that's if the sermon is offered in a spirit of let me give you my best thoughts on this subject, as opposed to here is God's word to you.
Immutable truth.
The immutable truth from which you cannot deviate. Now that is a different kind of message. I also believe that there's a mystical reality to preaching, as with everything human and divine. Just as it can happen when you're having a conversation with somebody, there is a distance between a person's mouth and another person's ears, right? And God does things in that space, wherever we are. And so I try to create enough space in preaching so not to get too much in the way of that. Because things happen. And again, every preacher will know what it's like to be thanked for a sermon that you never preached, right? Thank you so much for what you said. And then they tell you what, and it's like, yeah, I didn't say that. But you're welcome, right? You know? It's a
that happens all the time here, like Christmas and Easter. You're at the back door, and someone's like, great sermon. You're like, thanks. It was Austin who preached it.
Oh, yeah, there is that, too. There is that, too, yeah.
And Karl Barth does write about that. I mean, for him, preaching like God's word, there's like something.
Something happens.
Yeah, something profound. And he didn't think everything was God's word. But preaching for him, and in a way, that's what he wrote a whole shelf load of books for us, so that preachers would have some way of preparing to be that, to offer that opportunity, that possibility.
Yeah. I think it's a huge responsibility. I mean, 15 minutes of uninterrupted speech, you know, who gets that?
Yeah, that's true.
So to be really careful with it. Yeah.
Yeah, right. It's like more than a sitcom used to be.
You wrote this in chapter 7, The Hidden Virtue of Perseverance. There is also a mystical spiritual dimension to crossing the threshold of change that for leaders of faith like me feels like the power of the Holy Spirit. For when we reach what the Apostle Paul called the acceptable time, or what Greek philosophers refer to as Chyros, or opportune time, things happen with ease and momentum, and in retrospect, seeming inevitability. Such moments, however, are built on countless other moments of invisible toil. Can you tell us about a Chyros moment that you've experienced in the Episcopal Church?
Well, they elected me as bishop.
That must have been amazing. I mean, I just remember watching Austin on the telescreen, and he had so much joy in every part of his feature.
So, I mean, that's obviously really personal, but I would just say, again, the role of women in the church, generations and generations and generations of really hard, painful, excruciating work. And then when it happens, and then you get a generation or two out, and it's like, oh, well, yeah, like what's the big deal? The place of I mean, I rode on the crest of all the women and men who made my vocation possible, for which I'm grateful. But I didn't have to fight for it the way others did. I came up. I was ordained in the mid-'80s, and so my arc has been the inclusion of LGBTQ people. And that's just been the sort of arc of my ministry, watching that, and the struggle and the different places, and how, when things become normal after they're, how that works, right, over time, watching the movement of change. And then when the time is right for something to kind of move it forward in a quicker way, I find that to be just exhilarating. I was actually at the General Convention, maybe the two of you were as well, when the Supreme Court legalized marriage, right? And I remember that moment, and I remember all it leading up to it, because I felt like the society in some way got ahead of us, right? We had done so much groundbreaking work, and then at the time, the society just sort of rushed right past, and I was thrilled about that at the time, and we'll get it back, but I mean, we'll get all that energy back someday, but it was, I remember that being a really powerful moment. I don't know, I think there's a sense of, I can think of it more, those Chyros moments, in like the church I served in Minneapolis, right? Like we would struggle and struggle and struggle, and it wouldn't be right and wouldn't be right. And then there'd be a meeting and somebody would say something and people would say, yes, that's what we're going to do. And I'm like, right, great idea. We've been fighting for that for 6 months. And now you think it's your idea. Great, it's your idea, right? But okay, was it the Tao Te Ching who said, the great leader is the one who says, when the people say, lead the people to the idea, and then when the people say, we thought of it all by ourselves, right? Like that's that kind of thing of just when the time is right. So we're waiting for that now, right? Like when will the time be right for some things that need to change?
Yeah, maybe someone in this room is going to be an agent of that change.
Agent of that change.
I can't even imagine.
We're all going to be agents of the change. We just don't know where we are in the continuum of change.
Yeah.
There's a lot of thankless work that happens in the beginning that nobody gets credit for. But if it wasn't for that, the rest wouldn't happen, right? So there's a lot, and we may be, a lot of us may be there now, and we're not going to see it. But there may be somebody who's like in our midst, but we don't realize it, and they're the ones that will get to see it or to be at the cusp of it. We just don't know. We just don't know.
So related to Austin's question, what do you see as the biggest challenge that the church is facing now, or the biggest kind of challenges?
Oh, Malcolm.
Austin, either of you, Austin, you too.
Yeah, Malcolm, what do you think the
You
biggest
guys go to all
challenges
the-
are?
If they go to all the bishops' conference, what do they say at the bishops' conferences?
Well, I can help you a little bit on this. How about that?
Okay, thank you.
Okay,
You
so
go.
I just went to my second House of Bishops meeting, and my first one was last year at this time. And we actually did an exercise at that to talk about what are the major issues facing the world and the church right now. And one of the things that was fascinating to me is, you can imagine all the major crises we're facing: climate, racial reconciliation, just general humanity recognition, all sorts of things, right? But when we looked at that as bishops, the one that really got all of our attention was the formation of disciples of Jesus. Because if we do that correctly, we have an opportunity to actually address those things with some energy, force, resilience, perseverance, all the things that you talk about in the book. But for many years, it feels like the Episcopal Church has been willing to abdicate what it means to form people in the model of Jesus. Even if we're not ever able to rise to that level, we should at least have some ambition to try to incarnate it as much as we can.
I love that. Thank you, Austin.
I would say for me, one of the biggest challenges is that for those of us who are all in, right, who are in and we're in our communities and doing the work and we're bishops and we lose sight of the chasm between us and everybody else. And it's growing every day. It's just growing every day. And we don't, and because we're not paying attention to it in the ways that we might, we don't have the capacity, the vocabulary, the connection points to reach that, to reach over. So I think, in most of the congregations in our diocese, there's just genuine confusion. Why don't people want to come, right? Why don't they want to be with us? Why we're so welcoming? We're so, and I just think it's in some ways a kind of a confluence of small steps to take where we are as strong as we can be internally, which is what you're describing, and then also a deep and intense curiosity about those whose lives are not touched by what by what is of most value to us, and then being willing to ask the question: if we could give something of what is of most value to us, what would we be willing to let go of so that people could receive that piece that is of most value? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, one of the hardest questions in my experience. People in the diocese I serve, I'm sure it's not true in California, but in the diocese I serve, that's actually the hardest question, because there's such a fear of losing what we love. And I don't want to lose it either, but if it doesn't translate into something that reaches the felt needs of those coming up behind us or those around us, that will create the kind of weakness, institutional weakness, that will hinder our capacity to be witnesses for Jesus.
Yeah.
You too, that was great.
Yeah,
I'm so grateful. That was such a great answer from both of you. We have this letter, and it's from Don Fox. And he is a priest in the diocese, and he
I know Don.
I know, the guy's an amazing, mentor, and, faithful person. Is it okay if I just read his question?
I don't know what the question is.
Okay. I know, good point.
You read it, and then you see if it's okay.
He said, this is an observation and question to be addressed to Bishop Budde, and this is from Don. There are very disturbing similarities between the words and actions of President Trump and his associates and the words and actions of Adolf Hitler when they destroyed democracy in Germany in the 1930s and ushered in a barbaric dictatorship and reign of terror. Some German church leaders, such as Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others in the Confessing Church movement, criticized and resisted the Nazi onslaught, but they were too few and too late to have much effect. Hitler murdered most of them, so that's the observation. Here's the question. Is there any effort among religious leaders now here in the United States that might provide an effective resistance to help us save us from being dragged down into a fascistic dictatorship? And specifically, among Christian leaders, is there any significant effort beside yours to make it widely known that Trump's cruel, destructive words and actions are contrary to the gospel of Jesus Christ? I think both of you could probably answer this question.
I'm just going to let you do that.
Whew. I wonder if the parallels are more toward Mussolini than Hitler, actually. Mm-hmm. A rising dictatorship that was actually really appealing to the Italian people. And similar, one of the things that's different between the rise of Hitler and the rise of this phenomenon that is sort of organizing now around Donald Trump, but it's actually so much bigger, is that Germany was in a complete state of crisis economic. There was just complete and total despair.
Inflation.
And so there's some things about it that the parallels are harder to draw, although you see some of the same tendencies. And again, remember what I said before about questions where I have no expertise? So take everything I say with a grain of salt. Is there a unified movement to counter Trump with the same clarity of a Dietrich Bonhoeffer? I'm not sure that Dietrich Bonhoeffer was all that clear in the beginning. I think it was an evolving understanding for him. Some of you are nodding who perhaps know more about this than I do, but I think this is a really difficult understand. Is there a movement that we're all going to rise up and say no? No, that's not happening, right? Whatever that means, that's not happening. And I'm not sure. I'm not leading that charge, by the way.
In a way, though, the conversation about Christian nationalism is one that you're a part of.
Yes.
And I would say that if you go to the American Academy of Religion, we have authors who are writing books and coming to Grace Cathedral and talking to them about Christian nationalism and the danger that it poses for the United States. But
yeah, I wish I knew, and I wake up every morning and I wonder where we're headed. And I don't know. So where I tend to focus my own personal prayer and energy is on what I can see to say or do to be about an alternative that not only encourages others who are desperate for an alternative, but also might be compelling enough to speak to people who are somehow persuaded by this or caught up in this movement to make America great again, that we might present a vision of Christianity that actually resonates more deeply with their experience. That's what I'm trying to do and looking for people who are doing the same. But there are others who are mounting the protests. Believe me, they're in Washington every single day or every Wednesday in front of the Supreme Court. There was the whole movement on Saturday. I think it's going to take a lot of different what do I know? I don't know the answer to this question, but I'm listening, right? And I'm watching, and I think we all are, right? We're trying to figure out what's happening and how, with a spirit of love and nonviolence, and one of the respecting the dignity of every human being, we can go forward. I will say that the place where I have found the greatest guidance for my own leadership is in a project that has been begun by Tim Shriver and an organization that he founded called Unite, and it's called the Dignity Project. And if you just type in your search engine, Tim Shriver Dignity, what will come up is this entire organization that is based on that has built its identity on the assumption that what's killing us all in this country right now is the culture of contempt. The culture of contempt, that we speak and we treat one another increasingly with a normalized level of contempt, and fueled by what's known as the outrage industrial complex, right? There is just a lot of energy being spent keeping us all outraged at somebody for something. And that encourages us to talk about each other in dehumanizing terms. And this is a movement to say, if we could scale that back a bit and begin to and start with a basic level of recognition that everyone is inherently endowed with dignity. We may not respect what they say or do, but they have dignity as a human being. And that as we engage in matters on which we disagree, we will not go below the threshold of treating those with whom we disagree with contempt, right? And for me, that's just a framework now. That's just where I'm starting, even when I am confronted with some of the most contemptuous speech and behavior that you would ever want to have to face. I just don't want to respond in kind, right? I just don't want to go there. And in that way, I think it's more akin to what Martin Luther King was trying to say in his life, which is, hatred is just too big a burden to bear. It's just too much. So if we're going to respond, let's respond with love. It may not be a winning strategy, right? The darkness may wash over us, but that's one of the things I don't have control over. What I can control is how I encourage others to stand with dignity and to honor dignity in this moment. So that's what I got.
All right, I have two final questions. I'm going to have to skip one because of time.
Okay.
But the first and most important is, when did you become a Nancy Griffith fan?
I was driving in my car in Toledo, Ohio, and I had become, in very short order, I wasn't quite sure how this happened. I was in my 30s, and suddenly I was a mother of two with 2 cars, a house, and a job I was supposed to love, and most of the time I did love it, but I was like, how the hell did this all happen to me? And she sang a song that starts out, I'm working on a morning flight to anywhere but here.
Watching this evening wipe away my tears.
And I thought, I would love that. So she was just that voice that just said to me, like, how hard it is to be a grown-up. And that was my first introduction to her, and I just started listening to her, and how dare she die so young? Oh. I know. Just the most beautiful voice and the lovely, anyway. That's how.
I feel blessed to have seen her in concert. Mm-hmm. The last question, and then we'll wrap up our time. Is there anything we didn't ask that you wish we had? Mm-hmm. Or anything you'd like to share with those who are joining online and in person here at Grace Cathedral?
Well, you know that. Thank you. First of all, thank you. Can I just thank you all for... There's a blessing that bishops, it's not reserved for bishops, but it shows up in a lot of liturgies for bishops, and Michael Curry used to say it all the time, which I loved, where it's, go forth from this place in peace and be of good courage. Hold fast to that which is good. Render to no one evil for evil, but seek the good of all. As far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Love God, love your neighbors, and as best as you are able, love yourselves. And the peace of God will go with you. Thank you.
Amen.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, if you stand up. Thank you.
Have a good rest of this Sunday, everyone.